As the medical director and as someone who looks after 36,000 people each year in the biggest sporting event of the world, I can tell you that you can never be prepared enough for something like this. And on marathon morning, I'm shaving and I'm looking at myself in the mirror, and I always think this could be one of the best days of my year, or it could easily become one of the worst days of my year. And I'll just tell you a brief story about 2012. I was about 800 meters away from a cardiac arrest. And I thought, well, there are plenty of doctors. I don't really need to run to it because there were some good experts. But I did run because I was nosy, and on the way there, my mindset was, could it be vasovagal? Is it a false call? Is it just a collapse? I'm going to see someone in their 7th decade, male, maybe 6th decade, but that's what statistics tell us. So to arrive to see a 32-year-old woman in asystole, you can just imagine that no matter how professional you are, that for about 10 seconds, I stopped in my tracks with my mouth wide open before going into autopilot to start doing what we all dread we might have to do one day. So it is difficult, and with that, let's talk about what I want to say. We're going to briefly review the causes of sudden death in young athletes, but very briefly. We're going to highlight that screening athletes does not protect from cardiac arrest in every situation. We're going to demonstrate that early CPR and defibrillation are key components for survival, and emphasize the importance of an emergency response plan for a successful result. You've all seen today that although exercise is beneficial, some individuals do die, and these deaths are really very emotional. And these emotions are fueled by the fact that the vast majority of individuals that die from inherited or congenital abnormalities of the heart that can be detected during life, for which several therapeutic interventions are possible, ranging from lifestyle modification to pharmacological therapy, to ablation, to surgery, to give back 4 or 5 decades of life. The American Heart Association and the European Society of Cardiology all agree that something should be done to identify young athletes who may be at risk. So we are all in favor of a primary preventative strategy, but you've also heard that these have issues. The American program, which relies on history and examination, is not sensitive enough because the vast majority of athletes that die have no symptoms whatever, and no matter how good we feel with our stethoscopes around our neck, the vast majority of conditions that cause sudden death in young athletes cannot be detected with the stethoscope. The European Society of Cardiology have got a slightly more sensitive program. That's not surprising. If you add in a 12-lead ECG, everything becomes a little bit more sensitive. But there are some Achilles heels. There are a high number of false positive tests. And unlike Italy, most Western countries do not have the infrastructure to roll this out to every single young person in the country. And this type of ECG screening is really confined to the most elite echelons of sport, such as the Football Association, Rugby Union, and Lawn Tennis Association. So we have to rely on other measures. Why? Because even with ECG screening, we will fail to identify anomalous coronary arteries, premature atherosclerotic coronary artery disease. We may fail to recognize incomplete expressions of cardiomyopathy or ion channel diseases. And that leaves other situations that are specific for sport, such as commotio cordis, myocarditis, electrolyte disorders, hyperpyrexia and heat stroke, which will not be identified because they occur on the day of the event. So clearly, alternative strategies are required in the form of basic and advanced life support. We know currently, as things stand in London, that if you had an out-of-hospital cardiac arrest outside Sainsbury's, your chances of surviving to discharge without any cerebral impairment is between 6 and 10%. If we take this to airports and casinos in Las Vegas, where there is rapid response with defibrillators, that survival goes up between 41 and 70%. But clearly, this needs a time chain of survival Firstly, to recognize things early. There are studies that have shown that people who arrest often exhibit agonal respiration, which may be considered as just normal breathing. In many situations, a pulse may not be accurately identified for up to 2 minutes. About half young individuals that arrest actually show transient seizure-like activity, which can be misdiagnosed for an epileptic seizure other than cardiac arrest. So many arrests are witnessed, yet bystander CPR is hardly ever performed. We know that early defibrillation saves lives. If you can defibrillate within 5 minutes, the chances of survival are high, but for every 1 minute delay in defibrillation, survival rate drops from between 7 and 10%. We have some data on the sedentary population, but what about data in athletes? Well, most of the data in athletes comes from France and the Netherlands, and now probably a paper that will come out shortly from the United States. But here's data from France, where they actually looked at sudden cardiac arrest rates and success rates in France, and this was well-collected data in people running around between the ages of 10 and 75%. And all I want to take away from this is that the mean age of death was 46.1 years old, 93% were male, and only 15% survived. So that's the take-home message at the moment. A year later, a study from Netherlands, which focused predominantly on Amsterdam, looked at out-of-hospital cardiac arrest in the general population. This is exercising population. They found that the mean age of death in people who exercised was nearly 59 years old. Again, 95% male, but a much better survival rate of 45%. So what was the difference between France and the Netherlands? Let's compare them head to head. The Dutch guys were a bit older, if anything, so we'd have thought a slightly worse outcome. There were a large number of men, a large number of witnessed arrests, 89% and 94%. But let's look at the difference between the Netherlands and France in terms of resuscitation attempts. In the Netherlands, 87% got bystander CPR versus only 31% in France. In the Netherlands, 36% had an AED used versus only 1% in France. And because of this delay, in the Netherlands, 80% had a shockable rhythm, which is good, whereas in France, only 47% had a shockable rhythm. The time to shock in France for the first shock was 12.5 minutes, which is just unacceptable for survival. And that explains why the French data was worse than the Dutch data. But the French did go back and look at areas where they did have early access to defibrillation. The same group studied this again. So although their overall survival rate was only 16%, when they went to areas with high AED use, there the survival went up to 50% if you had bystander CPR and AED. So I think one thing that we must be doing in settings like this, apart from promoting the ECG and the echocardiogram, if you could promote that everybody should be taught basic CPR and should be taught how to use an AED, we may even get further than we are doing with just the ECG. So that's the older population. You saw that the mean age was between 45 and 58 years old, and that they were all male. But that's not real life's young sport. The young guys that hit the headlines, that make us worry, that ensure that courses like this exist, there is very little data in these individuals, and that's not surprising, because death rates are 1 in 50,000. People don't die every day. But here's one study that raised concern. Between 1999 and 2005, an American group studied 9 cases of sudden cardiac arrest in young individuals aged only 21, all of whom had had a witnessed collapse, all of whom had CPR started within a minute. AED was provided by the trainer in 5 cases and by emergency services in 4 cases, and time to defibrillation ranged between 1 minute and 7.5 minutes. 8 out of 9 people died, irrespective of that. 5 died from hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, 2 from commotio cordis, and 1 from myocardial infarction. And that sounds terrible, so the success rate was only 11%. And the authors had some explanation for this, that in 4 cases, the defibrillator was provided by emergency services, so there must have been a time delay. And that in 5 cases, the disease was due to hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, which may not be as responsive to defibrillation as coronary artery disease, for example. But let's go back and look at a bigger group. Now, of course, marathon running provides a beautiful opportunity to study young athletes, middle-aged athletes, and old athletes alike. So this study of cardiac arrest in long-distance running looked at over 10 million runs, in fact, nearly 11 million runs, where they reported only 59 deaths. I promise you this is an underestimate. But still, what we're looking at is survival. The survival was 29%, okay? And the factor that favored survival was bystander CPR. Bystander CPR increases your chances of surviving by 3.7 times. Time of collapse to CPR increased it by 1.32. The initial use of an AED, if you used it, and you could use it, increased survival rate by 3.71. So that just tells you what I've been telling you already. If you start CPR early, if you defibrillate, you will make a difference, and a big difference. But let's look at survivors versus non-survivors, okay? So at the top here, 29% that survived, and at the bottom here, 71% that died. As I've already said to you, the survivors, all of them got CPR. The time for the emergency services to arrive was 3.3 minutes in the survivor versus 7.7 minutes in non-survivors. VF was the presenting symptom in 88% of survivors versus only 35% of non-survivors. But the etiology. Amongst the survivors, none had hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, whereas amongst the non-survivors, 66% had hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. Indeed, in this study, the survivors were 20 years older than the non-survivors and more likely to have coronary artery disease. So if you're going to have an arrest during running, if you've got coronary artery disease, you're much more likely to live than the sort of diseases that we're talking about, such as hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. What's the explanation for that? And this is just me speculating. Imagine this is the substrate for hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, or ARVC. If we superimpose upon this the metabolic stresses of exercise, such as dehydration, adrenergic surges, electrolyte imbalances, acid-base disturbances, it may be that if you've got a myocardial disorder, these superadded stresses may not promote easy reversion to sinus rhythm. And I would suggest to all of you that are looking after young athletes where you do see arrests, myself, Courtney, and when we're using things like autopulse, one thing that should happen with all young athletes is you should get venous access as quickly as possible and pour volume into them as much as possible, because a contracted left ventricle is never, and an acidotic heart is never going to recover. So you need to start doing all of this apart from just defibrillating and CPR. So things don't look so good for the young. If we look at the Dresner survival trends, it's only 4 to 21%, and I could leave you here with such a gloomy feeling before lunch that we're good if you're middle-aged and older, but if you're young, then the writing is still on the wall despite having defibrillation. But every cloud has a silver lining. So let's go back and look at one of the biggest studies ever performed in high school children, school kids who are the most vulnerable and at risk of sudden death with hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. This is a study by Dresner. They looked at 1,710 US schools. Now, unlike us in the UK, where hardly any school has an AED, in the US, practically every school has at least one AED, and that's almost a regulation. They looked at 1,710 schools that had an on-site AED program, and they studied sudden cardiac arrest between 2006 and 2007. They found that if people went down, they got prompt CPR in 94% of cases and AED shocks in 83% of cases. And they found that 14 high school children were victim and 22 older non-students and school teachers or coaches were victim. But irrespective of this group, 64% in each group survived to discharge, which is far better than I've given you. I've given you figures of 29%, 15%, 48%, 26%, but nothing as high as 64%. How did they make that happen? Well, the mean time from collapse to CPR was 1.5 minutes, which we achieved at the marathon easily. The mean time from sudden cardiac arrest to first shock was 3.6 minutes, which we don't usually achieve easily. But clearly this sort of thing is not about just doing CPR and shocking people. You need 4 key things. Firstly, you need trained personnel who are used to recognizing early cardiac arrest, performing CPR, and using the AED. You need a very efficient communication system where you can actually tell people around the individual that's collapsed or report where it's happening so CPR, so that help can arrive very, very quickly. People need to know where the AED is located, whether it works and how it works and what you will do when you need to use it. And there should be a practice and review of the emergency response plan. It's pointless having an AED at a football club if no one knows where it's kept, whether it works, and what you'll do when you need it. Personnel need to, as I said, need to be able to recognize things early and perform CPR and perform AED. So that, of course, brings me to Matt Borgeson's study. Of course, something like this going on does raise the questions. Well, hold on a minute. If this can happen in elite sport, what is going on in football, for example, the most popular sport? So what they did was they surveyed clubs all over Europe to work out how many had AEDs, how many had an emergency response plan, trained personnel, a good communication system, how many people at the club could do basic CPR and advanced CPR. And the thing that came out here is, yes, only 72% had an AED. What worried me the most is only 26% could do advanced CPR. That's not the case in our Premier League, I promise you that. In our Premier League, everyone can do CPR. We've got 2 groups of medics working and a London ambulance. And these are the survival rates at the moment that we have. Our London Marathon survival rates are 43%. But I think if we can achieve what the schools achieve, we will be on to a winner. And it just makes me question whether we should all have defibs in our schools. But maybe that's a talk for another time. And although Christine said that the Americans have a lot to learn from us, I think we have a lot to take on board from them. Maybe AEDs in schools is not a bad thing. So in summary, sudden cardiac arrest in sport is rare. Survival rates are consistently influenced by speed of CPR and defibrillation. Adequate preparation for sudden cardiac arrest will improve success rates for survival. Thank you.